There is a phenomenon known as crowd crush that is way more horrifying than people realize. Believe it or not, in the history of mankind, this phenomenon is responsible for the loss of tens of thousands of people. In a crowd at a density of roughly 7 or more people per square meter, the mass of human beings actually begins to act more like a liquid than a group of individuals. The pressure can then become so intense that people are crushed and lifted off their feet and carried wherever the crowd is moving. But that is just the beginning. So in this video, we're going to go over what crowd crush is and why it's horrifying, and some of the most horrifying incidents of crowd crush in recorded history. As always, viewer discretion is strongly advised. It was a bright and sunny spring day in 1989, one of the first warm days of the season, making people feel like winter was finally behind them. This made it the perfect day for a high-stakes soccer match, and that's exactly what fans were gearing up for as the afternoon of April 15th approached. Supporters had been pouring into the area around Hillsborough Stadium in Sheffield, England for hours. Scarves were draped around necks and songs were echoing off nearby brick buildings. Of course, a few pints were being had too, and this only further stoked the excitement and atmosphere ahead of the 3 p.m. start of a semi-final match between Liverpool and Nottingham Forest. As game time approached, crowds packed into the stadium while many more waited their turn to get inside. The layout of the venue reflected a new era for soccer fans, one where most stadiums at the time had high steel fencing that separated spectators from the field. These were installed in response to what was termed hooliganism and previous instances where fans ran onto the field during a match. These pens, as they were called, were cramped spaces where supporters would stand shoulder to shoulder and sort of jockey for position to get the best view of the game. Now, Hillsborough Stadium had plenty of seats, but for those looking for a cheaper option to attend a game, the standing-only pens were where they'd end up. For the April 15th semi-final match, Liverpool supporters had been allocated the Leppings Lane end of the grounds, and within that there were several separate pens divided by metal barriers. The 2 central pens, located directly behind one of the goals, were considered prime viewing spots, and they were accessed through a tunnel that funneled fans from the back of the stadium. Less than an hour before kickoff, the first signs of trouble began brewing outside the venue. More fans had arrived and could be safely filtered through the available turnstiles before the 3 o'clock start time, and a bottleneck developed. The crowd outside the stadium continued to thicken with every passing minute, and people began to press forward as they became anxious that they might miss the opening minutes of the match. Those near the front, however, were trapped between the turnstiles and the growing mass behind them. And it was around this point that a police commander made a decision that would be catastrophic. In an effort to relieve congestion outside, he ordered the opening of Gate C. The problem was that Gate C was never intended to function as a standard entrance. It was designed primarily as an exit, and opening it introduced thousands of people into an already overcrowded part of the stadium. This only exacerbated the logjam of fans as they all encountered the tunnel leading to the central standing pens at once. Those already inside up against the steel perimeter fencing had little idea how many more people were still entering behind them. The pressure grew gradually as people at the back kept moving forward, unaware that there was nowhere left to go. Those in the front were pushed against the fencing and movement quickly became restricted, then completely impossible. The faces of those at the front were pressed against the metal chain link fence, but their cries of pain and panic could not be heard over the noise of thousands of voices inside the stadium. From the rear, it still felt like pre-match excitement, but at the front, it was turning into a horror show. As the crowd from the back continued to push forward, it only increased the pressure on those at the front. Bodies were forced tightly together and arms were pinned. Worse yet, chests were compressed and some supporters were lifted off their feet by the pressure alone. Others were wedged so tightly against the fencing that they could not expand their lungs to breathe. Many of those fans remained upright as they slowly suffocated to death. This wasn't a stampede in a traditional sense. Instead, what happened was a steady and more relentless phenomenon known as crowd crush. Those who realized the danger tried to climb the fencing to escape. Some were pulled up by others in desperate attempts to save them. Stewards and fellow supporters attempted CPR in the field once the victims were finally dragged free, but by then, for many, it was already too late. When the crowd was finally dispersed, 97 people had lost their lives. The youngest among them was just 10 years old, and another 766 were injured in what remains the deadliest disaster in British sports history. In the hours and days that followed, the narrative of what happened at Hillsborough turned ugly. Feeling the pressure of public blame for the incident, South Yorkshire police countered by suggesting that unruly and drunk Liverpool supporters had caused the crush. Sections of the media amplified the claims that fans had forced entry without tickets, that they had urinated on police officers, and that they had stolen property from the dead. Subsequent official inquiries, however, would clear the supporters of wrongdoing and determine that the victims were killed due to negligence, and the blame was pointed at failures in crowd control and stadium management. The Hillsborough disaster, as it's known, led to an inquiry that fundamentally changed British soccer. Standing terraces at major stadiums were abolished, and the all-seater stadium model became the standard. The steel fencing that once trapped supporters was removed too. These reforms have helped prevent similar tragedies in the United Kingdom, but the underlying force that killed 97 people that day did not disappear with new seating arrangements. The threat of crowd crush is still present anywhere large numbers of people gather, and incidents just like this one still occur to this day. When most people think about a crowd-related disaster, they might picture complete chaos and panic with people running wildly in every direction, trampling anyone who falls. It's a powerful image to be sure, but it's also usually wrong. A crowd crush is not primarily about people running, rather it's about people being unable to move. These incidents occur when a large group becomes so densely packed that individuals lose control over their own movement. The danger also isn't in the total size of the gathering, but in the number of bodies occupying a specific amount of space, and this is an important distinction. You can have tens of thousands of people spread out across a field with little risk of crowd crush at all. You can also have a few hundred people in the wrong configuration and create lethal conditions. In short, crowd density matters more than crowd size. At concerts, sporting events, rallies, religious gatherings, festivals, anywhere large numbers of people converge, the risk increases when movement is funneled into tight spaces. Think of entry gates, narrow corridors, alleyways, dead ends, and locked exits. When too many bodies are compressed into too little space, the crowd stops behaving like a collection of individuals and starts behaving like a single mass. Research over the past several decades has made clear that most crowd disasters are preventable and result from organizational failure such as poor planning, inadequate monitoring, insufficient staffing, or flawed design. One study examining incidents between 1992 and 2002 calculated that 232 people died and more than 65,000 were injured in crowd-related events during that period alone. A broader review that looked at 440 crowd surge incidents worldwide between 1980 and 2022 tallied up more than 13,700 deaths and approximately 27,000 injuries. This reflects a pattern, and the causes of it vary on the surface. Everything from overcapacity venues to inadequate number of exits to miscommunication can create a sudden influx of people into a confined space. Beneath those variables, however, lies the same underlying condition, which is too many people and too little room. In a dense crowd, bodies often press tightly against one another to the point where breathing becomes difficult as the weight of those in the back of the crowd transfers forward through the mass. When the force on the chest becomes too great, the lungs can't expand and oxygen intake drops. Victims experience what's known as compressive asphyxia, and they might even remain standing and unable to move until they lose consciousness. Even a relatively small crowd under the right conditions can generate enough force to bend steel railings. Now, understanding how a crowd crush forms begins with knowing how much space a person takes up. A person standing requires roughly 1 foot wide and 2 feet deep to remain comfortable and mobile. That's considered enough room to breathe, turn, and adjust your stance. When you start shrinking that space, that's when problems occur rapidly. At about 5 people per square meter, movement becomes restricted. You can still move, but it requires a lot of effort, and you start to lose the ability to choose your exact path. At 6 to 7 people per square meter, things change more dramatically. Bodies are pressed together continuously, and voluntary movement becomes extremely limited as your motion begins to depend on the people around you. At 8 to 10 people per square meter, individual control disappears almost entirely. This is the threshold where a crowd actually starts to act like a liquid. In extremely dense conditions, pressure travels through a crowd the way it travels through water. If someone pushes at the back, that force doesn't stop with the person in front of them. It transfers forward, body to body, until it meets resistance. When there's nowhere left for the energy to go, such as a barrier, wall, or a locked gate, the force compresses the people at the front. Witness accounts from crush survivors often describe the same sensations of their arms being pinned at their sides, their feet being lifted off the ground, and shockwaves traveling through the crowd. They actually describe being carried along without walking as they're moved by the pressure of strangers, and that's the fluid effect. And once a crowd reaches that state, individual strength, power, height, and fitness no longer matter. You simply cannot push back against a mass of thousands transmitting force through contact. What happened at Hillsborough in 1989 followed this pattern almost exactly, but the phenomenon of crowd crush itself is far older than that. Nearly 2,000 years before the Hillsborough disaster, the Roman Jewish historian Flavius Josephus recorded an incident that took place in Jerusalem during the Passover festival around 80 AD. This was no small gathering as pilgrims traveled from across the region to the Jewish temple, packing the city streets and holy spaces. According to Flavius, the spark of the crowd crush that occurred was trivial and frankly crude. A Roman soldier positioned near the temple during the festival raised his robe, bent over, and exposed himself to the assembled Jewish pilgrims. He then passed gas in their direction. The insult ignited outrage as the young men began throwing stones at the soldier. The Romans then called for reinforcements and the tensions escalated. As rocks flew, panic spread, and pilgrims rushed toward the exits. And in their attempt to escape, they funneled into confined spaces. Flavius described people pressing tightly around the exits, trapped against one another, trampled underfoot, and crushed by the massive bodies pushing from behind. The exact death toll is debated, but Flavius claimed that as many as 30,000 people perished that day. Historians suspect that the number was exaggerated, but even if the figure was far lower, the description is unmistakably that of a crowd crush. It proves that we've known about this phenomenon for millennia, yet we continue to design spaces and manage events in ways that allow crowd density to cross into dangerous territory. On June 16, 1883, Victoria Hall in Sunderland, England, hosted what was advertised as the greatest treat for children ever given. Traveling entertainers Mr. and Mrs. Fay had brought their variety show to town, and it was going to be a sight that left children in awe and wonder. The performance featured magic tricks, wax figures, marionettes, and a grand finale stunt billed as the Great Ghost Illusion. The promotion sold itself, and by showtime, roughly 2,000 tickets had been bought. Most of the seats in Victoria Hall were filled with children between the ages of 3 and 14. The show itself went off without a hitch and hit all the notes it promised to deliver. The children were delighted by Mr. and Mrs. Fay, but things weren't quite over just because the stage curtain closed. An announcement was made that children holding certain numbered tickets would receive toys as they exited, and while this was going on, entertainers began tossing gifts from the stage into the audience. This caused the children to go into a frenzy, and around 1,100 of them seated in the upper gallery rushed toward the staircase leading downstairs. They feared missing out on the toys, and they wanted to make sure they received them, but the staircase funneled them toward a single door at the bottom. And there were two significant issues with this door. First, it opened inward toward the crowd, and second, a fastening bolt restricted its opening so severely that children could pass through only one at a time. The door had likely been secured to ensure tickets were inspected in an orderly fashion at the beginning of the event, but when the scramble for prizes started, no one was positioned there to control the release or widen the opening. And with no guidance and no restraint, the children continued flooding down the stairs. Those at the front reached the door and couldn't pry it open any wider, while those behind kept pushing forward. Children stumbled and others fell over them, and the staircase became a chute feeding into a bottleneck. The mass at the bottom only grew, and one witness later described the pile as reaching more than 6 feet or 2 meters in height. The pressure from behind forced those at the bottom into the narrow gap, and many of them suffocated where they stood or fell. When adults in the auditorium figured out what was happening, they rushed to help, but the bolt securing the door was on the children's side. It could not be opened from the other side. Caretaker Frederick Graham, who was on the children's side, attempted to pull children free from the pile, but was quickly overwhelmed. As he would pull one free, 2 or 3 more would fall into its place. So seeing that unpiling the children was futile under the circumstances, he ran up another staircase and diverted about 600 kids in the back toward a different exit, ultimately saving their lives. By then, though, 183 had passed away, with most of them dying from compressive asphyxia. In the aftermath, the disaster was widely reported on and sparked a national outcry for accountability. Public anger focused not on the children's behavior, but on the design failure of a bolted door that opened inward. The inquiry that followed led to new legislation requiring public entertainment venues to install outward opening emergency exits. From that reform actually came the invention of the push bar emergency door. Changes, however, aren't always made in the fallout of such disasters. On September 24, 2015, more than 2 million Muslims from around the world were in Saudi Arabia for the annual Hajj pilgrimage. This pilgrimage is one of the 5 pillars of Islam, and it is considered a religious duty that Muslims are expected to perform at least once if their physical condition and finances allow. The pilgrimage consists of a series of rites carried out over several days in and around the holy city of Mecca. One of those rites is known as the Stoning of the Devil, which is performed at the Jamarat Bridge in Mina, just outside of Mecca. Pilgrims walk to the bridge and throw pebbles at 3 pillars, symbolizing the rejection of evil. It's a deeply meaningful ritual for those who partake, and historically, it's one of the most dangerous parts of the pilgrimage, as large crowds move on tight schedules through confined spaces in extreme heat. The 2015 incident occurred at approximately 9 a.m. at the intersection of streets 204 and 223 as pilgrims were on their way to the bridge. Temperatures that morning had already exceeded 110 degrees Fahrenheit or 43 degrees Celsius, and 2 large groups of pilgrims converged at the same intersection at once. Instead of flowing smoothly, the streams collided and heavy pushing followed. Those at the back continued moving forward, unaware that movement at the front had slowed or stopped, and the density increased rapidly. In such conditions, even minor changes in speed can trigger massive compression, and the heat of the morning likely intensified the urgency. Many pilgrims may have been attempting to complete the ritual quickly to escape the rising temperatures, while others were first-time participants unfamiliar with the geography and flow patterns of the area. Once crowd density reached critical levels, those factors became secondary though. Many victims were suffocated while still standing or crushed by trampling. The official death toll released by the Saudi government 2 days after the event listed 769 dead and 934 injured. But independent counts compiled from various reports placed the number far higher. Supposedly, at least 2,411 people died, perhaps many more, making it one of the deadliest crowd disasters in modern history. And the exact cause of the crush remains disputed as well. Authorities cited pilgrims failing to follow designated routes, while critics pointed to crowd control failures and inadequate traffic management. What's not disputed is that the pilgrimage is no stranger to similar instances. In 1990, a Hajj-related crowd crush claimed 1,426 lives, and between 1991 and 2005, at least 701 people were killed in various crush incidents. In 2006, 346 more died at the Jamarat Bridge. Despite all of these tragedies though, the ritual itself has never been changed to decrease the potential for dangerous crowd density at the bridge or elsewhere on the pilgrimage route. It was the first Halloween celebration since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, and an estimated 100,000 people flooded the Itaewon district of Seoul, South Korea on October 29, 2022. Mask mandates and social distancing requirements have been lifted, and after years of having to abide by those, the atmosphere felt like a big release for the people. The neighborhood, which is known for its bars, clubs, and winding streets, was completely packed by those eager to get out and blow off some steam. By around 8 p.m. though, the overcrowding was already noticeable. One attendee later said that a stretch of road that normally took about a minute to walk required more than 10 to navigate, as people were shoulder to shoulder on the streets. Conditions were so bad, in fact, that police had received at least 11 emergency calls related to dangerous crowding in the area. But despite this, no large-scale intervention occurred. At about 10:20 p.m., things reached the point of no return, and a crowd crush unfolded in a narrow, sloping alleyway measuring roughly 10.5 feet or 3.2 meters wide. A temporary iron wall installed along that part of the street further reduced usable space, and the alley had become a choke point. Crowds were attempting to move both up and down the alleyway at the same time. According to one witness, the initial trigger involved a group of young men pushing through the crowd, causing people to lose their balance. Those at the lower end of the sloped alleyway were compressed against those in the front of them, and people began to fall. Then, when someone went down, others began to topple over them. Video recordings of the event captured scenes that are difficult to comprehend, as hundreds were stacked up in layers 5 to 6 people deep. Emergency responders struggled to reach victims, and the density was so extreme the rescuers could not immediately extract everyone. It took hours to clear the pileup, and by the end of the night, 159 people were dead and another 196 were injured. Most of the victims were in their teens and 20s, and many of them were young women. Forensic investigations later confirmed that nearly all who died perished from compressive asphyxia, and the disaster became the deadliest crowd crush in the nation's history. Despite the reoccurrence of these types of tragedies, there are warning signs that appear long before the flashpoint. One of the most terrifying things about a crowd crush is how ordinary it can feel in the beginning. You might notice it as nothing more than proximity as things become a little tighter than usual. That by itself isn't unusual in a crowded, busy venue or street, but there is a point when things become much more risky. One of the clearest indicators that conditions are becoming unsafe is when you find yourself pressed from every direction. If you can no longer turn your shoulders freely, if your arms are pinned or trapped at your sides, or if you feel pressure from the front, back, and both sides simultaneously, then density is approaching critical levels. Another warning sign is the sensation of shockwaves traveling through the crowd. Survivors often describe it as a ripple or a sudden pulse of force that moves bodies like a wave in the ocean. It can apparently feel like an entire crowd lurches in one direction a few inches all at once. And if you feel your chest being compressed even slightly, you're already in a hazardous situation. Another early warning sign is the loss of vertical stability, like your feet being lifted off the ground or feeling like your body is tilting without the ability to correct it. Maybe the most critical mistake people make in hindsight is waiting too long to leave. Once you're in the middle of a high-density crowd behaving like a fluid, escape becomes extremely difficult. This is why early recognition is vital. If you feel contact on all sides and cannot move freely, that's the time to begin edging yourself toward the perimeter of the crowd. Fortunately, there are simple strategies that can improve your odds if you ever find yourself caught in that kind of movement. The first rule is not to fight the wave head-on. If a surge comes, trying to push directly against thousands of pounds of distributed force is useless. Instead, go with the movement while working sideways. Sideways movement is critical. Crowd pressure tends to travel forward, and moving laterally allows you to drift toward the edge of the density where force dissipates. Think of it as the same as slipping sideways out of a current rather than swimming directly upstream against it. Also, keep your feet moving in short, choppy steps. If you're only able to stand, do everything you can to remain upright. If you fall in a dense crowd, the threat to your well-being increases dramatically. If you stumble, get up immediately, but if you can't, curl slightly onto your side and protect your head and chest as best you can until you regain footing. By lying on your side, you reduce the risk of your chest being compressed by the force above you, and by keeping your arms in front of your chest, you create a small pocket of space to preserve your ability to breathe. And if you see rigid obstructions ahead of you, avoid them at all costs. Walls, barricades, fences, and stage barriers become compression points. The center of a crowd can be a dangerous place to be, but the front edge against a barrier can be deadly. It may also go without saying, but it bears mention, when entering any large event, make a mental note of exits. Look for side exits, secondary corridors, side streets, gaps in fencing, or anything else. Pay attention to the crowd's movement and mood throughout the event too. And maybe the most important is this: if you feel uncomfortable early, leave early. There is no performance, ritual, event, or celebration worth gambling against the physics of many people crammed into confined spaces.
If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching, and a special thanks to everyone who supports the channel on Patreon or as a channel member. If you're interested, we offer early access videos that are released roughly a week before the regular YouTube uploads. Also, if you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it using the form found in the description. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.